Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello guys, how's life today? Well, I hope that we are always in a good condition and happy situation. Well, we are from the third group of Interculturality in Language and Language Studies, A class. And in this video, we are going to present an analysis of 12 Years a Slave movie. Well, this analysis will be presented by our 10th group members consecutively. Hope you enjoy it and let's check it out.
Okay, the first one is the summary of the 12 Years Slave movie. The 12 Years Slave movie picks up the true story of Solomon Northup. He is a black man who had to slave for 12 years. Solomon Northup, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor in the movie, is a very individual who was forced into slavery by being stuck with a job offer. Since the first day of the trip, Solomon's name changed to Platt. He had to live a life of hardship and torment from his masters. The torments he received were not only physical but also in the form of human injustice. The torture and discrimination that the slaves received were portrayed vividly in a film to appeal to sympathy. Besides focusing on Solomon Northup, the film also features a slave girl. Her name is Betsy, who is a master's lost jewel. When it was discovered by the employer's wife, Betsy had to be willing to endure the brutal torture she receives. Overall, the 12 Years a Slave film describes the brutal process that black slaves had to face at the time, starting from how they are trafficked, spared from their families, persecuted when they fight or make mistakes, to how their lives seems as if there is only a choice between survival or death. It also tells how Salman Northup fought for survival and fought his way out of slavery. The story of how he, who at first wanted to fight but realized the fact that it was the same as seeking death. Several attempts he made to be free, but several times he decided he would only survive to life. Eventually, the white ends swiftly. Salman had the opportunity to meet Samuel Bess, an abolitionist or slavery opponent who came from Canada. Samuel Bess then helped Salman communicate with the outside world. After a long wait, Salman Northup was finally taken by his relatives, Mr. Parker, with proof of his freedom. Salman was able to return to the family he had long abandoned.
Alright, next I'm going to present about the characters' belief toward the issues on the movie. Well, first, Solomon Northup. He is the main character of the story who plays a role as a free black man in New York before getting kidnapped and sold to be a slaver in Washington, D.C. He is a married man where at the start of the story, he lives a pleasant life with his wife and their children in New York. He is an excellent fiddle player, a family man, and a hard worker. But his life was ruined since two men betrayed him and selling him into slavery in Washington, D.C. Since then, he lived as a slave for 12 years and known as Platt. He is one of the victims of slavery, racism, and discrimination against black people in America, which is abducted and sold into slavery, even though he is actually a free man. Facing cruelty personified by a malevolent slave owner, as well as unexpected kindnesses Solomon struggles not only to stay alive, but to retain his dignity. From the beginning, he strongly disapproved of slavery and was very much against that behavior. He is a very brave figure and never gives up toward his hard life. Therefore, from the beginning to the end of the story, he always tried to fight back and find a way to break free from the slavery. Next, James Brudge. He is a cruel slave dealer in Washington, D.C., who imprisoned Solomon, Eliza, Randall, Emily, Clemens Ray, Jones Williams, and several other Negroes in a basement. His character was very cruel and restrictive. In this movie, he is one of the people who are against black people. He believes that black people is not more than a slave. He has absolutely no generosity toward the black people. Next, Mr. Brown and Mr. Hamilton. Well, they are the two men who tricked and trapped Solomon, then sold him to Mr. James Brudge. They are very cunning and dangerous. They both are the people who caused Solomon into slaves, which caused him experience many hardships and oppressions in his lives. Therefore, it's clear that both of them go against the black people and support the activities of slavery and exploitation of the black people. Well, next, William Ford. He is the first master of Solomon who bought Solomon and Eliza from Mr. James Brudge. He is a kind-hearted person and has a very good attitude towards his slaves. He never tortured or beat his slaves and always treated them like humans. He even protected Solomon from Mr. Tibbetts' cruelty. So even though he still buys and employs black people, he is likely to do so because of his environmental factors. If he had grown up elsewhere, he would likely to be against slavery. The next one is Mrs. Epps. She is Edwin Epps' wife. Actually, she is a good person, even towards her slaves. However, once she was annoyed, she would take an action to retaliate. For example, when she felt jealous to Patsy because her husband seems interested in her, she would hate her and often look for her fault and always try to convince her husband to beat and whip Patsy. She is the type of person who will give feedback according to what she received. So if someone does not cause trouble with her, then she will not bother them as well. Therefore, she could be against the slavery or vice versa. Well, she is kind of uh, do not reject it, but she could treat her slave quite well.
Okay, guys, and here I would like to tell you about the characters' beliefs toward the issue. There are 7 characters that I will explain about, and those are Mr. Tibbetts, Mr. Edwin Epps, Mr. Hakim, Patsy, Mr. Armsby, Bess, and Mr. Parker. So here are the characters that play the significant roles. For the first is Mr. Tibbetts. He plays the role as the cruel lord at Mr. Ford's house. In this movie, he agrees with the slavery phenomenon. Before Pat or Solomon arrive to Mr. Ford's house, he becomes the mainstay partner for Mr. Ford, and Mr. Ford also believes the whole duties in Mr. Tibbetts. However, after Pat's arrival, he has the new rival, especially when Mr. Ford becomes friendly to Pat. Mr. Tibbetts hates Pat more because Pat is the Negro and the slave who tries to get the Lord's attention. Timmy's loathing increased when Mr. Ford also acted like he proud to Pats, and he is the lucky lord for having the smart slave like Pats. The second character is Mr. Edwin Epps. He is a very cruel lord for Pats. He even hates the Negro more than whatever in this world. He disagrees about the Negro who has become the free man. He will whip the slaves 40, 100, or 150 lashes if the Negro ignores the Lord's command or if the Negro does something worse. He acts brutally when knowing the Negro broke the rules he made. Until the plague strikes his cotton field, he also realized that he was hated by his God. He also doesn't believe about the sin of doing slavery. He despises the past utterances while past warns him about the sin in doing slavery and that he will get the punishment toward his action to the Negro. The third is Mr. Hakim. He is the kind people. He also becomes the lord after Mr. Epps for a while. He believes that the slaves deserve to have the presents for the good works they have done. He has been contrast attitude with Mr. Epps, who is very cruel to his slaves. Meanwhile, Mr. Hakim acts well and he will give the present to the slaves who have done their duties well. He even gives Pat the violin as the presents. Next is Patsy. She is the slave who is loved by Mr. Epps. She disagrees with the act of slavery. She believes that the slaves deserved to be the free men. Since Mr. Epps loved and interested in her, Mrs. Epps is jealous, and she even wants her husband to sell Patsy to another lord. Once, Patsy was hopeless, and she asked Pat to kill him and threw her to the sea in order she is free from the slavery. Patsy struggled to escape herself from Mr. Epps, but she can. Next is Mr. Armsby. He is Pat's friend. He is from the white races. He acts like he disagrees about the slavery, but he cannot do anything. Until Pat asks him to send his letter to Marksville Post Office in order Pat will free from the slavery after someone sent and show his freedom's letter. However, Armsby betrays his promise to help Pat and Mr. Epps already known towards Pat's planning. Next is Bess. He is also Pat's friend. He comes from Canada and he becomes Mr. Epps' slaves. He also disagrees towards the slavery and he cares about the slavery's phenomenon that they confront. He even rebukes Mr. Epps because he doesn't give the good attention for his slave. Mr. Epps acts well to Bess only because Bess from the white race. Here, Bess hated how Mr. Epps believes and reveals that he proudly realized that the Negro was the property for him. Bess also speaks that there is no fear for the slavery. Bess even says that there is no difference between the white and the Negro, and he also questioned Epps' right towards the slaves. And last is Mr. Parker. He is part saver from the slavery. He also contrasted with the ex-slavery. Mr. Parker is the beginning of the happy life with confront by Pat or Solomon. Mr. Parker feeds Pat to rescue him from the slavery by showing Epps the freedom's letter that Pat has.
Okay, for the next material is the expectation of character in this movie. For the first character is Solomon Northup. Who is Solomon Northup? Solomon Northup is the author and protagonist of the memoir. He is born a free black man in New York, where at the start of the story he lives a pleasant life with his wife Annie and their three children Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. He is known by the community as an excellent fiddle player, a family man, and a hard worker. This trait unknowingly led him into a trap. When needing a source of income to help his family, Solomon agrees to travel to Washington, D.C. with two new acquaintances. Those are Brown and Hamilton, to play the fiddle in the circus. The two men betray Solomon, selling him into slavery to James Barge. Solomon lives as a slave for 12 years for three different masters. The first master is the kind-hearted William Ford. Then the second master is the violent John Tibbetts. And finally, the exceedingly cruel and evil Edwin Epps. Solomon is known to his master and fellow slaves as Platt, a name given to him by Barge. From there, Solomon's life, which initially is a man who successfully turns into a slave. He became a talented slave because he had the ability to play the pedal and was able to carry out what he knew according to his abilities. Therefore, he became a slave who constantly struggled to prove his independence, Besides that, Solomon's talent as a fiddle player provides him a sense of comfort and solace during his years as a slave and enables him to make a little money by performing at other slave owners' social gatherings. He also distinguished himself as natural as harvesting sugar cane and a skilled carpenter, a skill which eventually leads him to cross paths with a Canadian carpenter. That is, he is Bess, who helped Solomon regain his freedom, especially during Edwin Epps' violence 10 years ownership. Solomon finds hope in God and the prospect of seeing his family again one day. This dream is fulfilled at the end of the movie, when Solomon returns home to New York to find his wife and children alive and well. For the next characters is Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. Merrill Brown. Merrill Brown is one of the two men, along with Abram Hamilton, who convinced Solomon to travel with them from New York to Washington, D.C. to take part in their circus. Brown and Hamilton betray Solomon by drugging him, beating him, stealing his free papers, and selling him into slavery. And Abram Hamilton. Hamilton, with help from his accomplice Brown, convinced Solomon to travel from New York to Washington, D.C. to play fiddle in a circus, with which the men are connected. Once in Washington, D.C., Hamilton and Brown drug Solomon, steal his free papers, and sell him into slavery. Jadi mereka berdua adalah orang yang menjual Solomon kepada seorang ahli perbudakan, yakni Barge. Mereka berhasil membujuk dan meyakinkan Solomon untuk ikut bersama mereka ke Washington DC. Yang kemudian Solomon di sana dijual dan dijadikan seorang budak. And for the next character is William Ford. Who is William Ford? Ford is Solomon's first master, as well as Solomon's only kind and compassionate master. Ford purchases Solomon, whom he knows only as Platt, along with a slave named Harry and another named Eliza from slave dealer Theophilus Freeman. Ford is married to Mr. Ford, whom he treats with tenderness and love. A fatherly
devout Christian man, Ford treats his slaves like family, and his slaves consider him their father figure in return. Ford frequently acts as Solomon's protector even after Solomon is sold to the erratic, hard to place John Tibert. Solomon deeply respects for and knows that he only owns slaves and is a proponent of slavery because of his environment. Had he grown up in the North, Solomon believes that he would certainly be against slavery. Okay, for the next character is John Tibert. He is the comforter who buys Solomon from William Ford when Ford runs into financial troubles, a sharp contrast from the warm and tender Ford. Tibet is cruel and erratic master, frequently trying to harm or even kill someone despite the fact that Solomon is a hardworking and skillful craftsman. He eventually tries to hang Solomon and almost succeeds, but he is stopped at gunpoint by an overseer named Kevin. Ultimately, Ford compels Tibet to sell Solomon, leading Tibet to sell Solomon to the physicians Edwin Epps. Seseorang yang telah membeli Solomon dari William Ford yakni John Tibet. John Tibet adalah seorang yang sangat kejam, sehingga karena kekejamannya, Ford memberi usul kepada John agar menjual Solomon kepada Edwin Epps, yakni Tuan Solomon yang terakhir.
Next, number 5, Edwin Epps. Epps was heavy, tall, with high cheekbones, blue eyes, and frequent drunk. He is a violent racist who ordered his slaves to harvest at least 200 pounds of cotton a day, and slaves who do not reach the target will be punished. But he was like to slave named Patsy. He was very happy because Patsy was such a diligent slave. She could harvest more than 500 pounds of cotton in a day. So Edwin Epps is not good character with their bad attitude to his slaves, always torturing and even harassing them like happened to Patsy and the other slave. 6. Mrs. Mary Epps. She is an Epps wife who is jealous of Patsy because she sees the strange behavior of her husband with Patsy. She often hurt Patsy physically until one day she provokes her husband when Patsy is not at the plantation to punish her. She made a good provoked her husband that Patsy ran away from the plantation and was eventually sentenced. Even so, Patsy only went to crutch. Its behavior of wife that jealous to her husband, it can show that she only hurt physically to Patsy. 7. Samuel Bess. He is a worker from Canada who built an Epps home pavilion. He is disliked by Epps because he is against slavery. According to him, in this world, humans are equal regardless of what color their skin. Bess is the person who helped Solomon to send letter to Saratoga Springs. Even though he is white like Epps, it turns out that his heart and mind are far different. He is a good person that sought against the slavery done by Epps. Since when Solomon told what happened to him so far and the behavior of Epps on slaves, he really disliked Epps and helped Solomon to send his letter. And the last is Patsy. Number 8, Patsy. Patsy, a 23 years old black slave of Edwin Epps.
Epps often praises her but also harasses her. She was often hurt by Epps' wife because of her jealousy. Because of that, she always went to despondent and suicidal as the years went on, whereas she is a jolly. She is not comfortable with the situation, often harassed and tortured by them. This can be seen when the scene she asks Solomon or Plaid to kill her and throw his body into the river because he can't stand the behavior that she had so far. But Solomon doesn't want to do it because he is afraid it can harm himself.
So in the next slide, we are discussing about intercultural interactions between white and black people in the 12 Years a Slave movie. Intercultural interaction is a discipline that studies communication across different cultures and social groups, or how culture affect communication or interactions. It describes the wide range of communication processes and problems that naturally appear within an organization or a social context made up of individuals from different religious, social, ethnic, and educational backgrounds. Intercultural interactions is also referring to the behavior, including but not limited to verbal and nonverbal communication, that occur when members of different cultural groups engage in joint activity. In this sense, it seeks to understand how people from different countries and cultures act, communicate, and perceive the world around them. With regard to intercultural communication proper, it studies situations where people from different cultural backgrounds interact. Aside from language, intercultural communications focuses on social attributes, thought patterns, and the cultures of different groups of people. It also involves understanding the different cultures, languages, and customs of people from other countries. Identity and culture are also studied within the disciplines of communications to analyze how globalization influences ways of thinking, beliefs, values, and identity within and between cultural environments. So the intercultural interaction consists of verbal communications and nonverbal communications. So what is verbal communications? Verbal communications refers to the use of words for communications purposes. It comprises both oral and written communications. Written communication channel includes executive memos, letters, company newsletters, emails, web pages, bulletin board postings, manuals, and reports. Oral communications channel refers to telephonic conversation, face-to-face meetings, speeches and presentations, video conferences, and etc. And here are some examples from the movie. And nonverbal communication is the transmissions of messages or signals through a nonverbal platform such as eye contact, facial expressions, gestures, postures, and the distance between two individuals. In other words, nonverbal communication refers to the behavioral aspect of communications, both intentional and unintentional. Hence, nonverbal communication is also regarded as communication devoid of words. It includes the use of visual cues such as body language or kinesics, distance or proxemics, and physical environments or appearance of voice, or they call it paralanguage, and of touch or haptics. So here are some examples from the movies.
Here I will mention and explain any intercultural interaction, verbal and non-verbal communication from the data movie of 20 Years a Slave data source. So the first is torment actions committed by white people. It is non-verbal. So because they are different, the white-skinned people and black-skinned people in the movie. So white people recognize themselves as the highest race than the black-skinned people. So the white people treat the black people as a slave, and then white people easily to do what they want, like torturing them, like in the movie. And then the second is the white people used to call the black people nigger. It is verbal. The second communication in here. As I know, nigger is a rude term to call black person, and it is prohibited right now. In the film, Tibet's as a carpenter of the master called the slave nigger. This term also to look down black skin race. For your information, in this film, the white skin people and the black skin people have a different culture. So this is where the intercultural communication happen in here. And then the third, John Tibet's a white people smirking while his eyes going up and down toward the black people. This is a non-verbal communication. Tibet thinks that his race is superior, so he doing that. As I know, smirking while eyes going up and down to check someone appearance, like John Tibet's do when he saw black skinned people in front of him, and then he start to smirking and his eyes going up and down to check their appearance. That is kind of underestimating someone, because you look the appearance, not their moral or behavior. And then the last is when Mr. Ford as the master shakes Blade's hand to show he's grateful. This is a non-verbal communication or interaction in the movie. So I think Mr. Ford is easily receive difference between him and Blade. He's a good person because he can receive another culture, different culture from the slave culture. When he saw a dark-skinned person, he doesn't underestimate him, and then he just easily to receive the difference between him and another culture.
Well, let's move to the part evaluate the data sources. First aspect is similar conflict of slavery and torture. This film tells about slavery, torture, and racism that occurs between white and black people in America. So, from this case, is also often encountered in real life. Well, there are buying and selling people in Dutch colonial era. Buying and selling people during the Dutch colonial era had become commonplace. During the 17th century, a lot of slaves were imported from South Asia, especially India. The sending of slaves in Indonesia finally stopped because India was no longer controlled by the Dutch. Finally, they used Indonesian local people as a merchandise. These slaves were sold to wealthy Dutch family in Indonesia for 90 reals. In comparison, the price of a bag of rice is only 2 real. This means that humans are only in 45 bags of rice. And next, the phenomenon of mistresses. Well, not all high-ranking Dutch officials in Indonesia took their children and wives with them. Many of them who come along to Indonesia will be confused about how to follow their biological flow. And finally, they made the woman their concubine, the slave of lust who must serve the master forever. And the next is modern slavery with the mode of TKI or Indonesian manpower. It is no longer a secret that many of the Indonesian migrant works end up becoming slaves at home or abroad. They are forced to work hard but do not get what is due to them. Instead, they are told to pay many things so that the salary continues to be cut. In other countries, they also often get unpleasant treatment from people who are considered as employers. Well, next is Negro slave trade in America. The slave trade became a very profitable business in America and Europe, and their main object was the Negro or black people. Many of them were kidnapped from their nationality, tortured, and made into slaves and traded. Apart from being slaves, the women were also made to satisfy the lusts of their master. And next part is interculturality aspects in the movie. First is racism between blacks, Negroes and white in America. America's systemic racism begins with slavery and the various state or federal codes or laws that regulate the practice of slavery into law. South America is a slave society, not just a society with a slave. However, after slavery was abolished, laws similar to slavery code and continued to oppose black people. After the Civil War, this black code had an explicit passage for depriving black Americans of freedoms. Black codes vary from country to country, but their legal basis centers on homelessness laws that allow an American African to be arrested if he is unemployed or lost. And next is stereotype and discrimination against black people. Well, black Americans who are domestic refugees fleeing state funded terrorism are suspected of crime, employment, drugs. Police departments across America are responding with more black codes and the aggressive policies of the black community. Black life has always been criminalized and inhumane in America. During the presidency of Barack Obama, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and many other African Americans who are unarmed, including the police, but also led by a black president, and many Americans managed to grab. Well, now social media raised awareness of this injustice and helped create the Black Lives Matter movement, the hashtag now devoted to George Floyd's death.
Northam's testimony was damning evidence against the entire system of slavery in practice at the time in southern United States. Yet, a black man and former slave, Northam's accusations of white cruelty would have been subject to great skepticism, even in the North. The editor's preface, Wilson provided, was a primitive attempt to counter accusations that Northup had simply aggravated or made it all up as fiction. By including this preface, Wilson lent the weight of his reputation as a respected white man, scholar, and editor to Northup's story, saying in effect that to call Northup a liar was to call Wilson himself a liar as well. Additionally, by declaring upfront that Northup's statements were corroborated by abundant evidence, Wilson delivered a not so
a not so subtle legal challenge to be a position. If pro-slavery apologists intended to discredit Northam's historical record, he warned that then they had better be ready to address the evidence that Wilson and his abolitionist colleagues had already collected as proof. The point Wilson seems to making with both his endorsement and challenge is Solomon Northup is telling the truth. Northup establishes an empathic connection with his readers right away by sharing tender recollections of his family, his father, his education, his marriage, and his children. His memories even evoke warm, relatable mental images that anyone can identify with and that make him real for readers. For example, he described his children by saying their young voices were music in our ears, their presence was my delight. Through this kind of memories, he becomes an everyman all can relate to. Someone through whom we can view the slave's experience through intimate eyes.
Well, that's all our presentation today. We hope that it will be beneficial for all of us. Thank you very much for watching. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.